The grand deliberation chamber had not been this full in over 100 years. Every seat, every pod, every standing platform was occupied. Delegates from 34 spacefaring civilizations filled the enormous hall, and the noise of their conversations rose up into the vaulted ceiling like the sound of a living ocean. The chamber itself was carved from the heart of a hollowed asteroid, and its walls were lined with ancient stone that had witnessed 10,000 years of galactic politics. Light came from floating orbs that drifted near the ceiling, casting a pale blue glow over everything below. Ambassador Tolik Vron floated inside his fluid-filled pod near the front of the chamber. He was Velori, a species that lived their entire lives suspended in a thick, warm liquid that carried nutrients to their translucent skin. His body glowed faintly with bioluminescence, soft pulses of green and blue rippling across his chest as he processed the data streaming into his neural link. He had been preparing for this session for 3 weeks, and he still did not feel ready. The reason was simple. Today, the Galactic Concord would discuss the admission of a new species. This was not unusual in itself. New species applied for membership every few decades. Most were turned away. Some were admitted as junior observers, allowed to watch but not vote. A rare few were granted provisional status, a kind of probationary membership that could last centuries before full rights were given. But this species was different, not because they were powerful, not because they were ancient. In fact, by every measure the Concord used to evaluate civilizations, they were utterly unremarkable. They called themselves humans. Tolik adjusted his position in the pod and looked out across the chamber. To his left, the Krethevi delegation occupied a raised platform built to support their heavy, armored bodies. The Krethevi were insectoid, each one standing nearly 3 meters tall, with thick exoskeletons the color of dried blood and compound eyes that reflected the light in hundreds of tiny mirrors. Their mandibles clicked constantly, a sound that other species found deeply unsettling. The senior hive speaker, a massive female named Vrecht, sat at the center of their group, her 4 arms folded across her chest plate. To his right, the Drahel stood in their customary silence. The Drahel were the oldest active members of the Concord, a species of towering beings whose bodies were made of something that looked and felt like living stone. They stood between 4 and 5 meters tall, and they moved with a slowness that other species often mistook for stupidity. This was a mistake that no one made twice. The Drahel were patient, intelligent, and when they chose to act, they acted with a force that had ended wars. Their delegation consisted of 3 individuals. They had not spoken in open session for over 60 years. The noise in the chamber began to quiet as the session moderator, a small, 6-limbed creature from the Pelani species, climbed to the central podium and activated the translation matrix. Every word spoken from the podium would be instantly converted into the native language of every delegate present, delivered through implants, earpieces, or direct neural feeds depending on the species. Delegates of the Galactic Concord, the moderator began, its voice high and thin, but amplified to fill the chamber. We are gathered to discuss the formal admission request of the species known as Homo sapiens, referred to commonly as humans, originating from the Sol system in the outer region of the Orion Arm. A ripple of murmuring passed through the crowd. The Orion Arm was considered a backwater, a sparse and unremarkable stretch of the galaxy that had never produced a species of any significance. I yield the floor to Ambassador Tolik Vron of the Velori Collective, who has prepared the official intelligence dossier on the applicant species. Tolik drifted forward in his pod until he was beside the podium. A holographic display activated around him, filling the air with data, charts, and images. He took a slow breath of his nutrient fluid and began. Fellow delegates, the species in question emerged from a single planet, third from their star, a modest yellow dwarf. The planet itself is classified as a Category 7 death world. This caused a stir. Death worlds were planets with active geological violence, extreme weather, dangerous fauna, and unstable climates. Most intelligent species evolved on calmer, more stable worlds. A Category 7 was considered barely survivable. Their biology is carbon-based, Tolek continued. They are bipedal, averaging between 1.5 and 2 meters in height. They possess no natural armor, no venom delivery systems, no regenerative capabilities of note, and no psionic abilities whatsoever. Their average lifespan, even with their current medical technology, does not exceed 200 standard years. The Krethevi senior hive speaker let out a sound that was the insectoid equivalent of laughter. Her mandibles clacked together sharply. 200 years, she said, loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. My Eglayers live longer than that. Laughter spread through portions of the chamber. The Velori delegates pulsed with amused colors. Even some of the more reserved species allowed themselves quiet sounds of amusement. Tolek waited for the noise to die down. He did not share their humor. Something in the data bothered him, though he could not yet say exactly what. Their technological development has been rapid, he continued. They achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 40 standard years ago. Since then, they have expanded to occupy 17 star systems. 17 systems in 40 years, said the delegate from the Morith Communion, a tall, thin being with skin like polished silver. That is aggressive expansion. It is not unprecedented, Tolek replied carefully. The Krethevi colonized 23 systems in their first 50 years of FTL capability. Yes, Vrek said, her compound eyes glittering. And we had the military strength to hold them. What do these humans have? Soft skin and short lives. More laughter. Tolek moved to the next section of his presentation. Details on their military capabilities are limited. Humanity has been reluctant to share information about their defensive forces. What we do know comes primarily from long-range observation and intercepted communications. He paused. The holographic display showed a series of blurry images captured by deep space probes that had passed through human-controlled territory. The images showed shipyards, orbital stations, and vessels of various sizes. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would concern the conquered. Based on our analysis, Tolek said, their naval capacity appears to be modest. We estimate a fleet of approximately 300 vessels, mostly medium-tonnage cruisers and light carriers. Their weapons technology appears to be kinetic and energy-based, roughly equivalent to Conquered standard from perhaps 2 centuries ago. The chamber relaxed visibly. 300 ships was nothing. The Conquered maintained a combined fleet of over 12,000 warships, anchored by the Drahel stone Leviathans, which were the most powerful vessels in known space. In summary, Tolek said, humanity presents as a young, biologically unremarkable species with limited military capacity and aggressive but manageable expansion patterns. They have formally requested admission to the Conquered and have announced that they will be sending a delegation to the Nexus. He hesitated. I should note one additional detail. The humans did not phrase their communication as a request. They informed us that they would be arriving. This caused a brief silence, followed by dismissive sounds from several delegations. The Krethevi hive speaker waved one of her 4 arms. The arrogance of children. They will learn their place soon enough. The session moderator called for comments. Several delegates spoke, most of them echoing the general sentiment. Humanity was unimpressive, their boldness was amusing, and the Conquered should admit them as junior observers at best. One delegate suggested they be turned away entirely to teach them respect. Another proposed a waiting period of 50 years before even considering their application. Through all of this, one delegate remained silent. Liaison Iran Salvek of the Nethari sat in his chair near the back of the chamber, his long fingers steepled in front of his narrow face. The Nethari were a species of diplomats. They lived for over 1,000 years, they rarely fought, and they survived by understanding other species better than those species understood themselves. Iran had held his position for 300 years, and in that time, he had developed an instinct for danger that had nothing to do with weapons or warships. Something about this situation felt wrong. He had read the intelligence dossier more carefully than most. He had noticed things that the other delegates had not. The expansion rate, for instance. 17 systems in 40 years was not just aggressive. It was methodical. The humans had not expanded in a random pattern. They had secured resource-rich systems, established defensive positions at natural choke points, and built supply chains that connected every colony to every other colony through at least 2 independent routes. That was not the behavior of a young species stumbling outward into the galaxy. That was the behavior of a species that had studied the map very carefully before it took its first step. And then there was the matter of the intelligence itself. The Concord's information on humanity was limited. Tolik had said as much. But Iran had spent enough time in intelligence work to know the difference between a species that was hard to observe and a species that was actively preventing observation. The blurry images from the deep space probes, the intercepted communications that contained nothing of military value, the complete absence of any data on their most advanced weapons systems. This was not the profile of a primitive civilization. This was the profile of a civilization that understood exactly what the conquered was looking for and had made sure it would not find it. Iran raised his hand. The moderator acknowledged him. "I have a question for Ambassador Vron," he said. His voice was soft, as was the Nethari way, but it carried clearly through the translation matrix. Tolik turned to face him. "Of course, liaison. You said the humans have announced they are sending a delegation. Did they specify the composition of this delegation? How many ships? What class?" Tolik checked his data. They did not provide details on their delegation's composition. They stated only that they would arrive at the Nexus within 10 standard days. "And we have no intelligence on what they might send." "No, our observation capabilities in their core systems are limited." Iran nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ambassador." He said nothing more, but the unease in his chest did not go away. The discussion continued for another 2 hours. Eventually, the council voted on how to receive the human delegation. The result was predictable. The humans would be welcomed, but they would be welcomed properly, which in the language of the conquered meant they would be reminded of their place. The decision was made to assemble a show of force. A combined fleet from multiple conquered species would arrange itself in formation around the Nexus station, visible to any approaching vessel. It was a common tactic used when receiving new species, a way of saying welcome and know your place in the same breath. Over the next several days, warships began arriving at the Nexus from across conquered space. The Krethevi sent a battle swarm of 40 fast-attack ships, their hulls bristling with plasma cannons. The Velori contributed a dozen bioorganic cruisers, living ships that could heal their own damage and adapt to enemy weapons in real time. The Morith Communion sent their flagship, a sleek and beautiful vessel that could generate gravity wells powerful enough to trap enemy ships in place. And the Drahel sent the stone Leviathan. It arrived last, as the Drahel always did. The stone Leviathan was 4 kilometers long, a massive slab of engineered rock and metal that had been the most feared warship in the galaxy for over 3,000 years. Its weapons could crack the crust of a planet. Its shields could withstand the focused fire of an entire fleet. In all its history, it had never been defeated in battle. It had never even been seriously damaged. The assembled fleet arranged itself in a crescent formation facing the direction from which the humans were expected to arrive. Over 100 warships, representing the combined military power of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, hung in the darkness of space like a wall of metal and light. On the observation decks of the Nexus station, delegates gathered to watch. The mood was festive. Drinks were served. Wagers were placed on the size and composition of the human fleet. The Krethevi bet heavily that the humans would bring at least 20 ships, trying to look impressive. The Velori thought 10 was more likely. The Morith delegate wagered 5, nodding that humans seemed to favor efficiency over display. Iran Solvik stood alone at a viewport near the edge of the main observation deck. He did not drink. He did not wager. He watched the stars and waited. On the 8th day, long-range sensors detected an incoming signature. A single contact, approaching from the direction of human space at faster-than-light speeds. One contact, just one. The sensor operators reported this to the fleet commanders, who reported it to the delegates. The reaction was immediate and amused. One ship. The humans were sending a single ship to meet the assembled might of the galactic Concord. The Krethevi Hive speaker laughed so hard her mandibles cracked against each other. One ship, she bellowed. They send one ship. Perhaps they could not afford two. Even the normally reserved Velori pulsed with bright colors of amusement. The mood on the observation deck became almost giddy. This was going to be even easier than they had thought. The young species was sending one small vessel, probably their best cruiser, hopping to make an impression. Iran did not laugh. He stared at the sensor display, watching the single dot approach, and the feeling in his chest grew heavier. One ship. Why would a species that had meticulously secured 17 star systems, that had carefully hidden its military capabilities from the most advanced intelligence network in the galaxy, that had informed rather than asked the Concord of its arrival, why would that species send just one ship? Unless one ship was enough. The dot on the sensor display grew closer. The fleet adjusted its formation, the crescent tightening slightly, weapons systems humming at standby power. The observation decks filled to capacity. Every delegate who could be present was present. They all wanted to see the look on the humans' faces when they saw what the Concord could do. Iran Solvik pressed his long fingers against the cold glass of the viewport and watched the empty space where the human ship would arrive. The stars were quiet, the fleet was ready, the galaxy was about to change. None of them knew it yet. The sensor contact was 3 minutes from arrival. Every warship in the Concord fleet had its passive scanners focused on the same point in space, a patch of empty darkness roughly 200 kilometers ahead of the crescent formation. That was where the mathematics said the human ship would drop out of faster-than-light travel. On the bridge of the Drahal stone Leviathan, the command crew stood at their posts in perfect silence. The Drahal did not speak when they worked. They communicated through subtle vibrations in the stone floor beneath their feet, tremors so faint that no other species could detect them. The ship's commander, a being named Kordeth, stood at the forward viewport and watched the darkness with eyes like polished granite. He had commanded the Leviathan for 600 years. He had fought in 11 engagements and had never known defeat. He was not afraid of a single human vessel. But he was paying attention. The Drahal always paid attention. On the Nexus station, the observation decks were packed beyond capacity. Delegates stood shoulder to shoulder, or hovered in their pods, or clung to the walls with adhesive limbs, all of them facing the massive viewports that looked out into the space where the fleet waited. The Krethevi had brought food and were eating noisily, treating the event like a festival. The Velori had dimmed their bioluminescence in anticipation, their bodies dark except for occasional nervous flickers. Liaison Iran Solvik had found a spot near the top of the main observation deck, away from the crowd. From here he could see both the viewport and the faces of the delegates below. He wanted to watch both. He wanted to see the ship arrive, and he wanted to see how the galaxy reacted. 2 minutes. The sensor operators across the fleet began their final checks. The Krethevi battle swarm tightened its formation. The Morith flagship activated its gravity well generators to standby mode. The Velori biocruisers rippled their living hulls, a reflexive response to stress. 1 minute. Ambassador Tolik Vron floated in his pod at the front of the observation deck, his body pulsing with steady blue light. He had his neural link connected to the station's primary sensor array, feeding him raw data in real time. He watched the numbers scroll past: velocity, trajectory, mass estimate. The mass estimate was still resolving, still changing. That was unusual. Normally, a ship's mass signature stabilized well before arrival. This one kept climbing. He frowned, or made the Velori equivalent of a frown, a darkening of the light along his brow ridges. He started to say something to the delegate next to him. He never finished. At the exact predicted moment, something happened in the space ahead of the fleet. But it was not what anyone expected. There was no flash of light. There was no energy discharge. There was no tunnel, no tear, no burst of radiation that normally accompanied faster-than-light arrivals. Space bent. That was the only way to describe it. The stars in that patch of darkness shifted, warped, curved, as though an invisible hand had pressed a thumb into the fabric of the universe. The distortion lasted less than 2 seconds, and then it was gone. And the ship was there. It was simply there, as though it had always been there, and the universe had just now noticed it. One moment there was empty space, and the next moment there was something in that space that had no right to exist, something so large and so dark that the mind struggled to accept it as real. For exactly 4 seconds nobody said anything. No delegate spoke. No sensor operator reported. No commander gave an order. For 4 seconds, the combined population of the Nexus station and the conquered fleet simply stared. Then every alarm on every ship went off at the same time. The first reports came from the sensor operators, and they came in fragments, broken by confusion and disbelief. The numbers did not make sense. The instruments had to be wrong. Recalibration was requested, performed, and completed. The numbers did not change. The human ship was 37 kilometers long. 37 kilometers. The figure appeared on screens across the fleet and the station, and it sat there like a wound, impossible and undeniable. The Drahel Stone Leviathan was 4 kilometers long and was considered the largest warship ever built by any known species. The human vessel was more than 9 times its size. But size was only the beginning. As the sensor data poured in, each new reading was worse than the last. The ship's energy output was beyond anything in the Concorde's experience. The power signature was consistent with a contained stellar core, a miniature star harnessed and held inside the vessel's hull. This was a technology that the Concorde's best scientists had theorized about but had never been able to achieve. The humans had not only achieved it but had made it portable and put it inside a warship. The ship's hull was made of a material that did not exist in any Concorde database. It was dark, almost perfectly black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Passive scans revealed layered armor of extraordinary density, with structural patterns that suggested the material could repair itself. Active scans returned nothing. The ship's surface ate sensor pulses the way it ate light, swallowing them completely and returning no data at all. The weapons arrays were visible but unidentifiable. They lined the ship's flanks in rows, hundreds of them, each one larger than most Concorde warships. The analysts could not determine their type or yield because nothing in their databases matched the configurations. They could only estimate based on the power conduits feeding each array, and those estimates were so high that several analysts simply refused to log them, assuming their instruments were broken. The ship's shields were not active, but residual energy readings suggested a layered defense system of at least 12 independent shield harmonics, each operating on a different frequency. The Concorde's most advanced warships used 3 layers. 12 was not just superior. It was a different kind of thinking entirely. And the ship was beautiful in the way that a blade was beautiful. It was angular, sharp-edged, with clean lines that spoke of purpose rather than decoration. It was not built to impress. It was built to do a job, and the job was very clearly the complete and total destruction of anything that stood against it. The fact that it was impressive was simply a side effect of what it was. One of the Valori analysts on the station, a young female who had been monitoring energy signatures, removed her neural link with trembling hands and said to no one in particular, "That is not a ship. That is a mobile extinction event." The phrase spread through the station within minutes. It was repeated in a dozen languages. It would eventually be quoted in history texts across the galaxy. On the observation deck, the festive mood had died as completely as if someone had opened the chamber to vacuum. The Krethevi had stopped eating. Their compound eyes were fixed on the viewport, and their mandibles had gone still for the first time anyone could remember. The Valori had gone dark, their bioluminescence extinguished entirely, an involuntary fear response that they had not experienced as a species in over 4,000 years. The smaller delegations had gone silent. Some had backed away from the viewports entirely. A few were already leaving the observation deck, moving with the hurried steps of people who had suddenly realized they were standing too close to something very dangerous. Ambassador Tolik Vron floated in his pod, motionless, his body completely dark. The data was still streaming through his neural link, and every new number was a hammer blow to everything he thought he knew about the galaxy. He had told the Council that humanity's military capacity was modest. He had told them their technology was 2 centuries behind. He had been wrong. He had been so catastrophically wrong that the scale of his error defied calculation. In the fleet, chaos was spreading. Communications channels overloaded as ship commanders shouted at each other, demanding orders, demanding explanations, demanding someone tell them what to do. Several ships had activated their weapon systems automatically, targeting locks snapping onto the massive human vessel like the instinctive snarl of a small animal faced with a predator it could not comprehend. The Krethevi battle swarm went to full combat readiness. Plasma cannons charged. Shields came up. The 40 fast attack ships pulled into an assault formation, a spreading pattern designed to overwhelm a single target from multiple angles. It was a formation that had broken fleets. Against the human ship, it looked like a handful of insects preparing to attack a mountain. The Morath flagship activated its gravity well generators at full power, creating distortion fields that could trap enemy vessels in place. The gravity wells reached toward the human ship and simply dissolved. They did not fail. They did not overload. They touched the edge of the ship's passive energy field and ceased to exist, like waves breaking against a cliff. On the stone Leviathan, Commander Kordeth felt the vibrations from his crew through the floor. They were afraid. The Drahul were rarely afraid. Kordeth looked at the human vessel through his viewport, and for the first time in his 600 years of service, he understood what it felt like to be small. The human ship was so large that it filled his entire field of vision. Its dark hull blocked the stars behind it, creating a void in the sky, a shadow where the universe used to be. The stone Leviathan, the most powerful warship the Conquered had ever produced, the pride of the Drahul fleet, was floating in that shadow like a pebble at the foot of a cliff. Kordeth sent a single vibration through the floor of his bridge. It was a command that the Drahul had not used in 3,000 years. It meant, "Do not engage." And through all of this, the human ship did nothing. It did not raise shields. It did not power weapons. It did not hail the fleet. It did not respond to the dozens of targeting locks that were painting its hull. It did not acknowledge the communications that were being frantically transmitted on every known frequency. It simply sat there, vast and dark and silent, and waited. The silence was worse than any weapon. A weapon could be understood. A weapon could be measured, analyzed, and countered. But silence from something that large and that powerful was a message in itself, and the message was, "I do not consider you worthy of a response." 12 minutes passed. 12 minutes during which the combined military might of the Galactic Conquered pointed its weapons at a single human ship, and the human ship did not even bother to raise its shields. 12 minutes during which every admiral and commander in the fleet slowly came to understand that their weapons, their ships, their entire military doctrine, Everything they had built over thousands of years was insufficient, not inadequate, not outmatched, insufficient. The way a stone knife is insufficient against a nuclear bomb, they were not in the same category of existence. Then, on the 13th minute, something moved. A bay opened on the underside of the human vessel, a door so small relative to the ship's size that the sensors almost missed it. A shuttle emerged. It was tiny, barely 30 meters long, a sleek and simple craft with no visible weapons. It detached from the warship and began a slow, unhurried approach toward the Nexus station. One shuttle, one small vessel, crossing the gap between the most powerful warship anyone had ever seen and a station full of delegates who had, less than an hour ago, been laughing about how primitive humans were. The fleet commanders looked at each other across their communication channels. The question was unspoken but universal: do we let it through? The answer came from the council itself. The session moderator, his voice audibly shaking, transmitted the order across all channels: stand down, lower weapons, allow the shuttle to approach, do not fire. No one argued. No one protested. The targeting locks disengaged one by one, a cascading surrender that moved through the fleet like a wave. Weapons powered down. Shields were lowered. The Krethevi battle swarm broke formation and drifted apart, their assault pattern dissolving into an aimless scatter. The shuttle crossed the distance slowly, almost leisurely, as though the pilot was in no particular hurry. It passed between the warships of the conquered fleet, and every crew on every ship watched it go by on their screens. It was so small, so fragile-looking, and yet not a single gun tracked it because every gun was pointed at the thing it had come from, and every gunner knew that firing would be the last thing they ever did. The shuttle reached the Nexus station and docked at the primary diplomatic bay. The docking clamps engaged. The airlock cycled. On the observation deck, Iran Solvek watched the shuttle's approach with a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. His hearts were beating fast, both of them, a physiological response that the Nethari experienced only in moments of extreme danger. He had known something was wrong. He had felt it in his bones for days, but he had not imagined this. No one could have imagined this. He looked around the observation deck at the faces of the delegates. He saw fear. He saw shock. He saw the beginning of a terrible understanding. The galaxy had just changed, and everyone in this room knew it, and no one knew what to do about it. Below in the diplomatic bay, the shuttle's door opened. Iran turned away from the viewport and began making his way toward the grand deliberation chamber. Whatever came next would happen there. Whatever walked out of that shuttle would walk into the chamber where the galaxy made its decisions. He moved quickly, but his mind moved faster. He was thinking about the human ship, about its impossible size and its impossible technology and its impossible silence. He was thinking about what it meant that the humans had built something like that and had chosen to send it here to this place, at this moment. And he was thinking about the shuttle. One small shuttle, carrying one delegation, from a species that the conquered had dismissed as primitive and weak. A species that had just parked a god in their front yard and sent a rowboat to say hello. The corridor ahead of him was crowded with delegates rushing toward the chamber. Their voices were high and tight with fear. Their footsteps were quick and uneven. The laughter was gone. The wagers were forgotten. The festival was over. Iran Solvek walked among them, tall and silent, and he did not speak because there was nothing to say. The universe had presented its argument. Now they would hear what the humans had to say. He reached the chamber and took his seat. The massive doors at the far end of the hall were closed. Behind them, somewhere in the corridors of the station, the human delegation was approaching. Every seat was filled. Every eye was forward. The chamber that had buzzed with arrogant conversation just days ago was now as quiet as a tomb. They waited. And in the space outside the station, 37 kilometers of black metal hung in the darkness, patient and silent, casting its shadow across the stars like a hand laid across the face of the sky. The grand deliberation chamber had been designed to intimidate. That was its purpose. The ancient architects who carved it from the asteroid's heart had understood that politics was theater, and theater required a stage that made its audience feel small. The ceiling rose 40 meters above the floor, lost in shadow. The walls curved inward like the ribs of some enormous beast. The central aisle stretched nearly 200 meters from the main doors to the speaking podium, a long walk designed to make anyone who approached it feel exposed, watched, and judged. It had worked on every species that had ever walked that aisle. Ambassadors from proud warrior races had quickened their steps. Diplomats from ancient civilizations had hunched their shoulders. Even the Drahal, who feared nothing, moved through the chamber with a heaviness that suggested respect for the space itself. Today, the chamber would meet someone new. The delegates had taken their positions. 312 individuals from 34 species filled the seats, pods, platforms, and alcoves that lined the central aisle on both sides. The arrangement was deliberate. The most powerful delegations sat closest to the aisle, forming a corridor of galactic authority that any newcomer would have to pass through. It was a gauntlet made of eyes and judgment. Armed guards stood along the walls. Krethavi warriors in full combat armor, their exoskeletons reinforced with plates of dark metal, held plasma lances at attention. Drahal sentinels, each one a pillar of living stone nearly 5 meters tall, stood motionless at regular intervals. Velori bioconstructs, shapeless masses of engineered tissue that could harden into weapons in milliseconds, clung to the upper walls like living decorations. The security was excessive, and everyone knew it. It was part of the theater. But today the theater felt different. The armed guards who were supposed to make the newcomer feel small instead made the delegates feel nervous. Every weapon in the room was a reminder that the thing outside the station, that vast dark shape hanging in space, could not be threatened by anything they possessed. Iran Salvek sat near the back of the chamber in his usual position. He had chosen this seat 300 years ago because it gave him a clear view of the entire room, every face, every reaction, every twitch and tremor. Today, he was grateful for the vantage point. The faces around him were telling a story. The Krethavi senior hive speaker, Vrecht, sat rigidly in her seat. Her forearms were folded across her chest, and her mandibles were locked in a position that indicated controlled aggression. But her compound eyes were moving constantly, scanning the chamber, checking the exits. She was afraid, and she was angry about being afraid. The Velori delegates had dimmed their bioluminescence to a low, steady glow. This was their equivalent of a whisper, a way of making themselves less noticeable. Ambassador Tolik Vran was barely visible in his pod, his body producing only the faintest light. He had not spoken since the human ship arrived. The data streaming through his neural link had broken something in his confidence, and it had not yet been repaired. The Drahal stood in their alcove, 3 massive figures of stone, and they waited with the patience of mountains. If they were afraid, nothing in their bodies showed it. The smaller delegations were clustered together, drawing comfort from proximity. The Pelani, the Sivari, the torch speakers of Eneth, species that had survived in the galaxy by being clever and cautious and knowing when they were outmatched. They knew they were outmatched now. They had known it the moment the human ship appeared. The session moderator stood at the podium, his 6 limbs gripping the stone surface. He had presided over this chamber for 40 years, and his voice had never shaken before today. He activated the translation matrix and spoke. "Delegates, the human delegation has docked at the station and is approaching the chamber. By the protocols of the conquered, they will be received and heard." He paused. The silence was so complete that the faint hum of the station's life support systems was audible. "Open the doors." The massive doors at the far end of the chamber began to move. They were ancient things, carved from the same stone as the walls, each one 15 meters tall and weighing thousands of tons. They swung inward on gravity-assisted hinges, slowly, with a deep grinding sound that vibrated through the floor. Light from the corridor beyond spilled into the chamber, a bright rectangle against the dimness. 312 delegates turned to face it. Hundreds of eyes, optical sensors, compound lenses, heat pits, and neural receptors focused on the opening. They expected an entourage. Standard diplomatic protocol for a species seeking admission called for a formal delegation of at least a dozen individuals, including a lead ambassador, military advisors, cultural attaches, translators, and a security detail. Some species brought as many as 50 delegates for their admission hearing. The Krethevi had brought 70, including a ceremonial guard of armored warriors who had performed a traditional war dance in the aisle. The doors finished opening. The corridor beyond was empty except for a single figure. One person stood in the doorway, one human alone framed by the light behind her. She was not tall, perhaps 1.7 meters, which made her smaller than nearly every other being in the chamber. She wore a dark uniform, simple and unadorned, with no medals, no insignia of rank visible at a distance, and no decoration of any kind. Her hair was dark, cut short, and her face was calm. She carried no weapons. She wore no armor. She had no guards, no aides, no translator, no entourage. She stood in the doorway of a chamber filled with 300 armed aliens and looked in at them the way a person might look into a room before deciding whether to enter. Then she stepped forward and began to walk. Her boots hit the stone floor with a sharp, clear sound that echoed off the curved walls. In the silence of the chamber, each footstep was as loud as a gunshot. She walked at an even pace, neither fast nor slow, down the center of the aisle that was designed to make newcomers feel small and exposed. She did not look small. She did not look exposed. She looked like she owned the floor she walked on. Every delegate she passed turned to follow her with their eyes. The Krethevi warriors along the walls gripped their plasma lances tighter. The Velori bioconstructs on the ceiling shifted uneasily, their tissue rippling. The Drahal sentinels did not move, but their stone eyes tracked her with a focus that was almost alive. She passed the delegation from the Morith communion. The silver-skinned delegates stared at her with an expression that mixed fascination and terror. She passed the Pelani section, where the small, six-limbed delegates pressed themselves back in their seats as though she carried a static charge. She passed the Velori pods, where Tolik Vron's body flickered with involuntary light, his fear made visible. She passed the Krethevi platform. Hive Speaker Vrecht watched her with all her compound eyes, mandibles locked, body rigid. The human did not look at her. She did not look at any of them. She looked straight ahead at the podium, and she walked toward it as though nothing else in the room existed. The aisle was 200 meters long. It took her nearly 3 minutes to walk it. 3 minutes during which 312 delegates of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations watched a single, unarmed human woman walk through their midst, and not one of them said a word. Iran Solvek watched from his seat at the back, and he understood what he was seeing. It was not bravery, although it was brave. It was not arrogance, although it could easily be mistaken for arrogance. It was a statement, delivered in the simplest possible language, a language that every species in the room could understand regardless of biology or culture. The statement was, "We are not afraid of you." Not in the way that the ignorant are unafraid because they do not understand the danger. Not in the way that the foolish are unafraid because they do not respect the consequences. This woman knew exactly where she was. She knew the weapons pointed at her. She knew the warriors lining the walls. She knew the warships outside the station. And she walked through all of it without hesitation, without armor, without even the comfort of a companion, because she and her species had decided that fear was not something they would show. And the reason they would not show it was hanging outside the station, 37 kilometers of darkness and power, speaking the same language in a different voice. One ship, one woman. The message was the same. We are here. We are not asking permission. and we are not afraid." The chamber was frozen. That was the only word for it. 312 beings from across the galaxy, beings who had conquered worlds and built empires and bent the laws of physics to their will, sat in absolute stillness and watched one human walk. She reached the podium. She stopped. She turned to face the chamber, and for the first time she looked at them. Her eyes moved across the room slowly, meeting the gaze of each delegation in turn. The Krethevi, the Velori, the Morith, the Draho, the dozens of smaller species huddled in their seats. She looked at each of them the way a person looks at something they are evaluating, not with hostility, not with contempt, but with a calm and thorough attention that somehow felt more unsettling than either. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. It filled the chamber without any apparent effort. The translation matrix carried her words to every delegate simultaneously, and there were no errors, no delays, no garbled phrases. Her words arrived in perfect translations, in every language, as though the humans had studied the conquered's translation protocols and mastered them before they came. They had. The delegates realized this in the same moment, and the realization added another stone to the growing weight in their chests. "My name is Captain Marin Ashcroft," she said. "I am the commanding officer of the Terran Commonwealth ship Erebus, Titan class, hull designation 001. I am here as the representative of the Terran Commonwealth and the 8 billion citizens of humanity." She paused, the silence held. "I will keep this brief, because I believe you have already heard most of what I came to say. You heard it when our ship arrived. You heard it in the silence that followed. I am here to put words to what you already understand." She clasped her hands behind her back. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but it had the effect of making her look even more composed, as though she was standing on the bridge of her own ship rather than in a chamber full of strangers who had the power to kill her. "Humanity does not seek conquest. We have no interest in ruling over other species. We did not build the Erebus to threaten you, and we did not come here to make you afraid. If you are afraid, that is your choice, and I respect it, but it was not our intention." She let that sit for a moment. "Humanity does not seek permission. We will expand into the galaxy as we see fit. We will explore where we choose, settle where we choose, and build what we choose. We have done this since the first human walked out of Africa on our homeworld and looked at the horizon and decided to see what was on the other side. We will not stop now." The Krethevi Hive speaker shifted in her seat. Her mandibles opened slightly, as though she was going to speak, but no sound came out. "What humanity seeks," Ashcroft continued, "is partnership, real partnership. Not the kind where one species kneels and another stands. Not the kind where admission to your conquered comes with conditions and hierarchies and waiting periods designed to remind the newcomer that they are less than those who came before. We have read your protocols. We know how you treat new members. We are not interested." She took a breath. "We are offering you something different, trade between equals, cultural exchange between equals, mutual defense between equals. We have things you want. Our ship makes that obvious. You have things we want. The knowledge of species that have traveled the stars for thousands of years has value, and we are not so proud that we cannot admit that." Her eyes swept the chamber again. "But I want to be clear about something. We are offering an open hand. The hand is open because we choose for it to be open, not because we need your approval, not because we need your protection, not because we cannot survive without you. We can. The Erebus is not our only Titan-class warship. She is simply the one we chose to send first." The weight of that statement settled over the chamber like a physical thing. She had said it calmly, without emphasis, as though she was mentioning an unremarkable detail. That made it worse. The implication was enormous, and she had delivered it as casually as a weather report. She unclasped her hands and placed them on the podium. "I was told that this chamber has heard 10,000 years of speeches. I was told that species come here and make grand statements about their civilizations, their histories, their right to stand among the stars. I will not do that. You do not need another speech. You need to understand one thing about humanity, and I will tell it to you now. She looked directly at the center of the chamber, at the place where the most powerful delegations sat. We did not come here because we needed you. We came here because we hoped you would be worth knowing. She stepped back from the podium. I am done. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of thought or consideration. It was the silence of 300 beings who had just had their understanding of the universe rewritten in 5 minutes by a woman who stood barely tall enough to reach the podium. Iran Solvik sat in his chair and felt something he had not felt in 300 years of diplomatic service. He felt wonder, not at the ship, not at the technology, at the woman, at the sheer, impossible audacity of walking alone into a room that could kill her and speaking to it as though it should be grateful for her presence. He reached into his coat and retrieved a small recording device, a personal log that he kept for moments of historical significance. He activated it and spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Personal log, Liaison Iran Solvik, Nethari Diplomatic Corps. Date, Standard Galactic Calendar, year 7412, day 188. I am recording this from the Grand Deliberation Chamber of the Galactic Nexus, moments after the first formal address by a representative of the human species. He paused, collecting his thoughts. One shadow crossed the chamber. That is what I will remember. One shadow, cast by one woman, crossing 200 meters of stone floor while 300 delegates held their breath. Not because we feared what she might do. We feared her because we finally understood what we did not know. He stopped the recording and put the device away. Around him, the chamber was beginning to stir. Delegates were turning to each other, whispering, gesturing, their composure cracking like ice in spring. The Krethevi were clicking their mandibles in rapid, agitated patterns. The Velori were poolsing with chaotic light. The smaller species were talking over each other in tight, frightened clusters. Captain Marin Ashcroft stood at the podium and watched them with the same calm expression she had worn when she entered. She did not fidget. She did not look uncertain. She stood like a woman who had said exactly what she came to say and was now waiting for the galaxy to catch up. The session moderator, who had been gripping the edge of the podium throughout her entire address, finally released his hold and straightened his small body. The delegate from humanity has spoken, he said. His voice cracked on the word humanity, and he cleared his throat. The floor is now open for questions and responses. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then everyone spoke at once, and the chamber erupted into the loudest, most chaotic session in its 10,000-year history. But through all the shouting and the arguing and the fear, one image remained fixed in the mind of every being who had been present. A single figure, small and dark against the pale stone floor, walking alone through a corridor of gods and monsters. Not hurrying, not hesitating, not looking left or right. One shadow crossed the chamber. And nothing was ever the same. The Grand Deliberation Chamber had not quieted in the 6 hours since Captain Ashcroft finished speaking. It had only grown louder. Delegates shouted across the aisles. Translation matrices struggled to keep up with the overlapping voices. The session moderator had called for order 11 times, and 11 times the chamber had ignored him. The arguments fell into 3 rough camps, and the lines between them grew sharper with every passing hour. The first camp, led by the Krethevi, demanded an immediate military response. Hive Speaker Vrek stood on her platform with all 4 arms spread wide, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. They come here with 1 ship and 1 soldier, and they speak to us as though we are children, she roared. This is not diplomacy. This is insult. If we do not answer strength with strength, every minor species in the galaxy will think the conquered is weak. Her warriors stamped their armored feet in agreement. the sound reverberating through the stone floor. The Krethevi had built their civilization on the principle that power must always be answered with power. To do anything else was to invite destruction. Several smaller species with similar martial cultures nodded along, though their enthusiasm was notably less vocal than it had been before the Erebus arrived. The second camp, led by the Villori, counseled patience and study. Ambassador Tolik Vran had recovered enough composure to speak, though his bioluminescence remained dim and uncertain. "We know almost nothing about this species," he said, his voice carrying the careful, measured tone of a scientist who has just realized his entire field of study is wrong. "We assumed they were primitive. We were incorrect. Before we take any action, we must understand what we are dealing with. Anything else is recklessness." Several delegations agreed. The Morith Communion, the Savari, the Pelani, and a handful of others argued that the smart move was to accept humanity's offer of partnership, at least temporarily, and use the time to learn everything possible about their technology, their society, and their weaknesses, if weaknesses existed. The third camp consisted of those who were too frightened to argue for anything at all. These were mostly the smaller species, civilizations that had survived in the galaxy by staying out of the way of the larger powers. They did not want to fight the humans, and they did not want to befriend them. They wanted to go home and close their borders and hope that whatever happened next happened to someone else. Through all of this, the Drahel had said nothing. They stood in their alcove like three pillars of stone, watching the chaos with eyes that revealed nothing. The Drahel rarely spoke in open session. When they did, the galaxy listened because the Drahel did not waste words, and their words were usually followed by action. So when the Drahel elder, the largest of the three, shifted his weight and turned toward the podium, the chamber fell silent in seconds. It was as though someone had thrown a switch. Delegates stopped mid-sentence. Hands dropped. Mandibles closed. Every eye in the room turned to the massive stone figure moving slowly, deliberately, toward the center of the floor. The Drahel elder was the oldest living member of the Conquered. No one knew his exact age. Some estimates placed him at over 12,000 years old. He had been present when the Conquered was founded. He had witnessed the rise and fall of species that no longer existed. His name, in the Drahel language, was a vibration that other species could not produce, so the translation matrix rendered it simply as the Elder. He reached a position near the podium and stopped. He did not step up to the podium itself. The Drahel did not use podiums. He simply stood and let the weight of his presence fill the room. When he spoke, his voice was deep and slow, like the grinding of tectonic plates, and every word landed with the force of something that had been considered for a very long time before it was said. "We have looked upon the human vessel." He paused, the chamber waited. "It is beyond what we can build. It is beyond what we can fight. It is beyond what we can break. We have measured it with our instruments and our experience and our understanding, and in every measurement it exceeds us." Another pause, longer this time. "We will not fight them. If others wish to fight them, they may do so. The Drahel will not join. This is not cowardice. This is recognition. The humans have built something that changes the nature of power in this galaxy, and we will not destroy ourselves by refusing to acknowledge what is real." He turned slowly, looking at each delegation in turn. "Discuss amongst yourselves." He walked back to his alcove and resumed his position of stillness. He did not speak again. The silence lasted for nearly a minute. Then the chamber exploded. The Drahel were the military backbone of the Conquered. Their stone leviathans were the most powerful warships in the fleet. Their ground forces were considered unbreakable. For over 3,000 years, the Drahel's commitment to the Conquered's defense had been the foundation on which galactic order rested. Without the Drahel, the Conquered's military deterrent was a fraction of what it appeared to be. And the Drahel had just said, in front of every species in the galaxy, that they would not fight the humans. The Krethevi were the first to react. Hive Speaker Vrek's compound eyes blazed with fury. "Cowards," she screamed. "Stone-brained cowards, you would surrender without a single shot fired." The Drahel did not respond. They never responded to insults. This had the effect of making the insulter look foolish, which only made Vrecht angrier. But the damage was done. Without the Drahel, the conquered could not mount a credible military challenge to the Erebus, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The Krethevi had 40 fast-attack ships. The Velori had a dozen biocruisers. The Morith had their flagship. Combined, they might be able to threaten a conventional enemy. Against a ship that was 9 times the size of the stone Leviathan and powered by a harness star, they were nothing. As the arguments continued, something else began happening, something quieter and more significant than the shouting. Small delegations began slipping out of the chamber, not through the main doors, which were watched, but through the side corridors that connected to the station's diplomatic wing. They moved in ones and twos, trying not to attract attention, and they all moved in the same direction, toward the docking bay where the human shuttle was parked. The Pelani were first. They were a small species, physically weak, with no military to speak of. They survived by making themselves useful to larger powers, and they had an instinct for recognizing which way the wind was blowing. Within an hour of the Drahel Elder's statement, a Pelani trade delegation was requesting an audience with the human representative. The Savari followed, then the torch speakers of Eneth, then the Morith communion, who had quickly done the math and decided that being among the first to ally with humanity was worth more than loyalty to a conquered that could not protect them. By the end of the day, 12 species had made informal contact with the human shuttle. Trade proposals, cultural exchange offers, and mutual defense inquiries arrived in a steady stream. The galaxy was reshuffling itself in real time, and the Conquered's old power structure was cracking under the weight of 37 kilometers of reality. Captain Ashcroft received the inquiries, acknowledged them politely, and promised follow-up consultations. Then she returned to her shuttle and flew back to the Erebus. The shuttle crossed the gap between the station and the warship, passed through the small docking bay, and was swallowed by the vastness of the ship's interior. The bay doors closed, and from the outside the Erebus looked exactly as it had before, dark, silent, and immovable. Inside was a different world. The Erebus was not just a warship. It was a city. Its internal volume was so vast that entire districts had been built within its hull, connected by transit systems that moved thousands of people through corridors wide enough to drive vehicles through. There were residential blocks where crew members lived in apartments with windows that looked out onto artificial skis. There were parks with real trees and grass, grown under full-spectrum lighting that simulated a planet-side day. There were laboratories, manufacturing bays, hospitals, schools, and recreation centers. There were restaurants and cafeterias, and a small district that the crew called the Strip, where off-duty personnel could find bars, music venues, and a cinema that showed movies from Earth. The crew numbered 80,000. They were engineers, scientists, soldiers, pilots, doctors, teachers, administrators, and 100 other professions that were required to keep a vessel of this size functioning. They came from every nation on Earth and every colony in human space. They spoke dozens of languages, followed dozens of traditions, and argued about everything from politics to sports to the correct way to make coffee. They were in every way a cross-section of humanity, messy, loud, opinionated, and alive. Captain Ashcroft's shuttle docked in the command section, and she stepped out into a corridor that bustled with crew members going about their duties. A young lieutenant saluted as she passed. A maintenance team was repairing a light fixture overhead, one of them telling a joke that made the others laugh. A group of off-duty engineers walked by carrying takeout containers from one of the cafeterias, arguing about something technical that Ashcroft did not catch. She walked to the command bridge, a massive room at the heart of the ship where dozens of officers monitored every system aboard the Erebus and every sensor reading from the space around them. Holographic displays filled the air with data. The main viewport, 20 meters wide, showed the Nexus station and the conquered fleet in the distance, small and far away. Her executive officer, Commander Don Akoro, was waiting for her. Akoro was a tall man with dark skin and a shaved head, and the kind of calm, steady presence that made him the perfect counterweight to Ashcroft's intensity. He had served with her for 12 years, and he knew her well enough to read the tension in her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes. "How did it go?" he asked. Ashcroft walked to the main viewport and looked out at the distant station. For a moment, she did not answer. Then she let out a long, slow breath, and the composure that she had worn like armor for the past several hours cracked, just a little, just enough for Akoro to see. "It went exactly as planned," she said. "But—" She turned to face him. "That walk was the hardest thing I have ever done, Don. 200 meters, 3 minutes. I have flown combat missions. I have faced down pirates in the belt. I have sat in a shuttle that lost its main engine during re-entry and brought it down on manual. None of it compares. I walked into a room full of aliens who could have killed me with a thought, and I had to look like I did not care." Akoro studied her face. "Did you?" "Did I what?" "Care." She almost smiled. "Every step. I cared about every single step. My hands were shaking behind my back the entire time. You know why I clasped them? Because I could not keep them still." She sat down in the command chair and rubbed her eyes. Around her, the bridge crew continued their work, but several of them were listening. They had been waiting for her to come back. They had watched the sensor feeds of her walking into the alien chamber alone, and they had held their breath just as the aliens had. "The question is whether they bought it," Akoro said. Ashcroft looked at him. "Every word I said was true. That is what makes it terrifying for them and for us." Akoro nodded. He knew what she meant. Everything she had told the Conquered was technically accurate. The Erebus was real. Its weapons were real. Its power was real. Humanity's refusal to bow was real. But the picture she had painted, the picture of a species so powerful that it could send one ship and one person and not worry about the consequences, that picture left out a great deal. It left out the cost. The Titan-class program had nearly destroyed Earth's economy. The Erebus was the product of 30 years of development, involving every major nation and corporation in human space. Resources that could have built colonies, hospitals, research stations, and infrastructure had been poured into a single vessel. The project had caused political crises, economic recessions, and social unrest on 3 continents. Entire generations of scientists and engineers had devoted their careers to it, many of them dying before it was complete. And when it was done, when the Erebus was finally launched and its systems brought online for the first time, the people who built it looked at what they had created and felt not triumph but terror, because they understood what it meant. It meant that humanity had bet everything on a single hand of cards. If the gamble worked, if the Erebus was enough to establish humanity as a power that the galaxy would respect, then the investment would pay off 1,000-fold. If it failed, if the galaxy saw through the bluff, if the Conquered decided to test humanity's strength, then the cost would be beyond calculation. Because the Erebus was not one of many, it was one of one. Ashcroft had told the Conquered that it was not their only Titan-class warship, that it was simply the first they chose to send. This was technically true. There were 2 more Titan-class hulls under construction in the shipyards orbiting Jupiter, but they were years from completion. Their power cores had not been installed. Their weapons systems existed only as designs on screens. They were empty shells, promises of future strength that could not help in the present. If the Conquered attacked the Erebus now with everything they had, they would almost certainly lose. The ship was that powerful, but if they somehow won, if they found a weakness or a vulnerability that human engineers had missed, then there would be nothing behind it. No second ship, no reserve fleet, just 300 conventional warships and 17 colony worlds full of people who had given everything they had to build one impossible thing. The gamble was not that the Erebus was strong enough. The gamble was that the galaxy would never test it. Akoro poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine near the bridge's rear console, the terrible, bitter coffee that was standard issue on military vessels, and that no amount of technological advancement had managed to make taste good. He brought one to Ashcroft and kept one for himself. 12 species have already reached out, he said, sitting in the chair beside hers. Trade proposals mostly, a few mutual defense inquiries. The Pelani want to discuss technology exchange. Ashcroft took the coffee. The Pelani want to be on the winning side. They always do. Can you blame them? No, that is exactly the response we wanted. If enough species align with us voluntarily, the conquered cannot act against us without fracturing itself. That was always the plan. Make them too invested in peace to risk war. She sipped the coffee and made a face. This is terrible. It is always terrible. Someday we will build a ship that can cross the galaxy, but still will not be able to make a decent cup of coffee. Meanwhile, on the Nexus station, liaison Iran Solvek had left the chaos of the deliberation chamber and retreated to his private quarters. The quarters were small and sparse, as the Nethari preferred, with a single desk, a sleeping mat, and a data terminal that connected to the Conquered's vast archive of intelligence records. Iran sat at the desk and began to search. He was not looking for information about the Erebus. Everyone was looking at the Erebus. Everyone was measuring its size and counting its weapons and calculating its power output. Iran was not interested in the ship. He was interested in the species that built it. He started with the oldest records he could find, data from deep space probes that had passed through the Sol system and the surrounding region over the past several centuries. Most of these probes had been launched by the Conquered for general survey purposes, mapping systems and cataloging any signs of developing civilizations. The probes that had passed near Earth had flagged it as a Category 7 death world with a pre-spaceflight civilization and had moved on. No one had paid much attention. But the probes had recorded data, electromagnetic emissions, atmospheric readings, surface imagery. And as Iran sifted through this data, arranging it chronologically and filtering it through his analytical training, a picture began to form. A picture of a species unlike anything the Conquered had encountered. Earth's geological record showed 5 major mass extinction events. 5 times, the planet had nearly sterilized itself, killing the majority of its living organisms. And 5 times, life had recovered and continued. The species that eventually became human had emerged in the aftermath of the most recent upheaval and had immediately set about trying to survive in one of the most hostile environments in the known galaxy. They had no natural armor, they had no venom, they had no claws worth mentioning, no wings, no ability to breathe underwater, no tolerance for extreme temperatures. By every objective measure, they should have died. The predators on their planet were faster, stronger, and better equipped. The climate was unstable. The geology was violent. They did not die, they adapted. They made tools, they made fire, they made language. They organized into groups and then into tribes and then into nations, and at every step they fought. They fought the planet. They fought the predators. They fought each other. They fought disease, famine, flood, and drought. They fought wars that killed millions of their own kind, wars so destructive that they developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet. And then they stood at the edge of that abyss and decided, just barely, not to jump. And then they kept going. They went to their moon. They sent machines to other planets. They built telescopes that could see the edge of the universe. They decoded the language of their own biology and began rewriting it. They built thinking machines. They split the atom. They fused it back together. Every catastrophe that would have ended another species, every disaster that would have sent a lesser civilization into permanent decline just made them angrier, more creative, more determined, more stubborn. Iran sat back in his chair and stared at the data on his screen. He had studied hundreds of species in his career. He had seen warrior cultures and scientist cultures and trader cultures and cultures so ancient that they had forgotten more than most species would ever learn. But he had never seen anything like this. The Erebus was not the product of a species that was inherently superior. It was not the product of ancient wisdom or vast resources or some genetic advantage that other species lacked. It was the product of pure, stubborn, irrational refusal to accept limits. Humanity had looked at every obstacle the universe had placed in their path and had responded not with acceptance or adaptation but with defiance. They did not go around problems. They did not wait for problems to pass. They attacked problems with every tool they had, and when their tools were not good enough, they built better tools, and when their better tools were not enough, they built tools that were impossible, and they kept doing this until the problem was solved or they were dead. And they were very, very hard to kill. Aaron closed the data terminal and sat in the dim light of his quarters thinking. Outside his window, he could see the distant shape of the Erebus, a dark line against the stars, barely visible but impossible to ignore. He understood now. The ship was not the threat. The ship was a symptom. The threat was the thing that had built it, a species that had been fighting for its survival since the day it evolved and had never once considered the possibility that it might lose. He reached for his personal log and activated it. Supplemental entry. I have spent the evening researching humanity's history and development. My conclusion is as follows. The Erebus is not an anomaly. It is not a lucky accident or a one-time achievement. It is the natural product of a species that has been forged by 10,000 years of relentless adversity into something the galaxy has never encountered before. He paused. We should not have laughed at them. We should have been paying attention. He stopped the recording and looked out the window again. The Erebus hung in the darkness, patient and still, and Aaron Solvek felt something shift in his understanding of the universe. It was smaller than he had thought. And it was about to get much more interesting. 3 days of debate shook the galactic Concord to its foundations. The grand deliberation chamber became a battlefield of words, threats, promises, and fear. Delegates slept in their seats or not at all. The translation matrix ran continuously, converting thousands of overlapping arguments into dozens of languages without pause. The session moderator gave up trying to maintain order and simply kept the chamber open, letting the storm run its course. The question before the council was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. What to do about humanity? The Krethevi pushed hardest for confrontation. Hive Speaker Vrecht had spent the 3 days in constant motion, moving between delegations, demanding alliances, promising military support and threatening those who refused. Her argument was consistent and forceful. If the conquered showed weakness now, it would never recover. If they allowed a species to walk into their chamber and dictate terms, every future newcomer would do the same. The conquered's authority depended on its ability to enforce its rules, and enforcement required the willingness to fight. But Vrecht's argument had a hole in it that grew larger with every passing hour, and the hole was shaped like a drawhole. Without the drawhole military, the conquered could not credibly threaten anyone, let alone a species that had parked a 37-kilometer warship outside their front door. The drawhole had made their position clear, and the drawhole did not change their minds. Vrecht knew this. Everyone knew this. But the Krethevi were a proud species, and pride made them slow to accept reality. The Velori argued for a different approach. Ambassador Tolik Vron had recovered enough from his initial shock to function as a diplomat again, and he used the 3 days to build a coalition of moderate species who favored engagement over confrontation. His argument was practical. Humanity had offered partnership. Whether or not that offer was sincere, it was better to accept it and learn from the inside than to reject it and learn nothing. Knowledge was power, and right now, the conquered had almost no knowledge of what humanity was truly capable of. Every hour spent arguing was an hour not spent gathering intelligence. The third camp, the frightened neutrals, gradually dissolved as the debate continued. One by one, they were pulled into Tolik's coalition or pressured by the Krethavi into taking a position. By the end of the second day, only 3 species remained truly undecided. On the morning of the third day, the session moderator called for a formal vote on humanity's admission to the Concord. The motion included a provision that had never been used before in the Concord's history: immediate Tier 1 status, equal to the oldest founding species. This provision was proposed by the Morith Communion, and it was the most controversial element of the entire debate. Tier 1 status carried full voting rights, veto power on military actions, and a permanent seat on the Inner Council. It had been earned by the founding species over thousands of years of cooperation and service. Granting it to a species that had arrived 3 days ago was, in the words of one furious Krethavi delegate, an insult to every civilization that built this Concord from nothing. But the Morith delegate, a shrewd diplomat named Terrales, had a simple response. Would you like to be the one who tells humanity they must wait 1,000 years for full membership? Would you like to deliver that message to the captain of the Erebus? I will arrange a shuttle for you. No one volunteered. The vote was called. Each species cast its decision through the translation matrix, their choices recorded and displayed on the central holographic screen. The numbers appeared one by one, building slowly as delegations confirmed their positions. In favor, 29. Against, 4. The Krethavi, 2 of their allied species, and 1 isolationist civilization from the far rim that voted against everything on principle. Abstaining, 1. The Drahal, who stated through the elder that they acknowledged humanity's existence regardless of any vote this body might take, which was the Drahal equivalent of saying the vote was irrelevant, and they would deal with the humans on their own terms. The motion carried. Humanity was admitted to the Galactic Concord with full Tier 1 status, effective immediately. The chamber erupted into a mix of applause, protest, and exhausted silence, depending on the species. Hive Speaker Vrecht stormed out of the chamber without speaking to anyone, her warriors following in a tight formation, their armored feet hammering the stone floor. The sound echoed through the hall long after they had gone. The news spread across the galaxy at the speed of light, carried by communication relays that reached every inhabited system within hours. The response was predictable in its variety. Some species celebrated, some panicked, some began quietly repositioning their fleets, and on a dozen worlds, governments that had been watching the proceedings from a distance began drafting their own diplomatic overtures to humanity, wanting to establish relationships before their rivals could. But the vote was not the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. 2 days after the vote, a faction within the Krethavi military decided to test the humans. The decision was made by a group of senior officers who had served under Hive Speaker Vrecht for decades, and who shared her belief that strength must be answered with strength. They did not inform Vrecht of their plan. They did not inform anyone. They acted alone, driven by a combination of wounded pride and genuine conviction that someone had to push back against the newcomers. 12 ships from the Krethavi battle swarm broke formation without authorization. They were fast attack corvettes, the smallest warships in the Krethavi fleet, crewed by veterans with decades of combat experience. They powered up their weapons, raised their shields, and accelerated toward the Erebus on an attack vector. They did not intend to fire. The plan was a show of force, an aggressive flyby at close range with weapons hot, designed to test the human ship's reactions and send a message that not everyone in the Concord was willing to kneel. It was a dangerous and stupid plan, but the Krethavi officers who conceived it were dangerous and stupid people who had confused courage with recklessness. The 12 corvettes crossed the distance between the Concord fleet and the Erebus in minutes, their plasma cannons charged and their targeting systems locked. They flew in a spread formation, approaching from multiple angles, exactly as they would in a real attack. Their sensors painted the Erebus with targeting data, Their weapons cycled to firing readiness, and their crews braced for whatever would happen next. On the Nexus station, sensor operators detected the unauthorized movement and reported it immediately. Alarms sounded across the fleet. Commanders shouted orders. The session moderator was pulled from a meeting and informed that 12 Krethevi warships were making an attack run on the human vessel. Panic, pure, absolute panic. Delegates ran for the observation decks. Fleet commanders scrambled to contact the Krethevi ships and order them to stand down. Communications channels overloaded with desperate messages. On the bridge of the Erebus, the sensor officer reported the incoming contacts with professional calm. 12 small vessels on attack approach, Captain. Weapons hot. Targeting locks active. Time to engagement range 90 seconds. Captain Ashcroft was in her command chair. She had not left the bridge since returning from the station. She had slept in the chair for 2 hours the previous night and had been running on coffee and determination ever since. She looked at the sensor display, saw the 12 dots approaching, and felt a cold spike of adrenaline in her chest. Classification, she asked. Corvette class, Krethevi design. Light armor plasma weapons fast but fragile. Threat assessment negligible. Ashcroft nodded. The 12 ships could fire everything they had at the Erebus and the shields would not even register it. The danger was not physical. The danger was political. If she destroyed those ships, the fragile peace would shatter. If she did nothing, the conquered would see it as an invitation to further provocation. She needed a third option. Weapons, she said. Standing by. Stand down weapons. I do not want a single cannon charged. The weapons officer looked at her with surprise but complied immediately. Around the bridge, the tension was thick enough to feel. Electronic warfare, Ashcroft said. Target those 12 ships. I want a focused sensor pulse, full spectrum, maximum penetration. I want every system on those ships shut down except life support. I want their engines dark, their weapons cold, their sensors blind, and their communications silent. And I want it done in one pulse. The electronic warfare officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Chen, looked at her console and then back at the captain. One pulse for all 12 simultaneously. Yes. That will require us to crack their encryption, bypass their firewalls, and override their hardware controls in less than a second. Can you do it? Chen looked at her console again. Her fingers moved across the controls. Yes, Captain, I can do it. Then do it. The Krethevi corvettes were 60 seconds from engagement range when the Erebus responded. There was no visible beam. There was no flash. There was no sound that could carry through the vacuum. There was only a single pulse of focused energy that crossed the distance between the warship and the 12 incoming vessels in a fraction of a second. Every system on every Krethevi ship went dark at the same instant. The effect was immediate and total. Engines died, weapons powered down, shields collapsed, navigation systems went blank, communication arrays fell silent, sensor displays turned to black. The 12 corvettes, which seconds ago had been screaming toward the Erebus at full attack speed, were suddenly drifting in space, dark and powerless, carried forward only by their remaining momentum. The crews inside the ships experienced a moment of absolute darkness as every light, every screen, every indicator went dead. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, casting the interiors in a dim red glow. Life support continued to function, air still flowing, temperature still regulated, but everything else was gone. The Krethevi crews scrambled. Officers shouted orders. Engineers tore open access panels and tried to restart their systems manually. Nothing responded. The ships were not damaged. Their hardware was intact. But every piece of software, every command protocol, every line of code that controlled their vessels had been overwritten, erased, and replaced with a single instruction. Stop. They drifted for 60 seconds. 1 full minute of darkness and silence and helplessness. during which the crews of 12 warships sat in their dead vessels and contemplated the precise nature of their mistake. Then at the 61st second, every system came back online simultaneously. Lights returned. Engines hummed to life. Weapons systems rebooted. Navigation displays flickered and resolved. The ships were fully functional again, exactly as they had been before the pulse, with one exception. Every navigation computer on every ship now displayed a message. It was written in perfect Krethavi script, using the formal military dialect reserved for communications between commanding officers. It read, "That was a courtesy. There will not be a second one." The 12 corvettes hung in space, their crews reading the message on their screens, and nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. On the Nexus station, the sensor operators watched in stunned silence as the 12 Krethavi ships sat motionless for a long moment, and then slowly, one by one, turned around and flew back to the fleet at minimum speed, weapons cold, shields down, in the universal posture of a vessel that was no longer interested in fighting. The incident was over in less than 3 minutes. The consequences lasted much longer. Within the hour, the Krethavi government had identified the officers responsible for the unauthorized flyby and placed them under arrest. Hive Speaker Vrecht, who had not known about the plan, was forced to issue a formal apology to the human delegation, an act that caused her physical pain but which she performed because the alternative was worse. The Krethavi were proud, but they were not suicidal. The message from the Erebus, "That was a courtesy, there will not be a second one," spread through the Concord like fire. It was repeated in every language, analyzed by every intelligence service, and discussed in every government. It became the most quoted sentence in galactic history within a week, not because it was threatening. Threats were common in galactic politics. It became famous because of what it implied. The humans had disabled 12 warships simultaneously with a single pulse. They had cracked Krethavi military encryption, bypassed their firewalls, overridden their hardware, and shut down every system on every ship, all in less than a second. And then they had turned everything back on again, cleanly and completely, without causing any permanent damage. This was not a weapon. This was control. The humans had demonstrated that they could reach into any ship in the Conquered fleet and turn it off like a light switch. They could do it without warning, without visible effort, and without causing harm. And the implication was clear. If they could shut down a ship's systems without causing damage, they could also shut them down while causing a great deal of damage. They simply chose not to. The difference between power and mercy had never been illustrated so precisely. 3 weeks after the incident, Liaison Iran Solvek received an invitation. It arrived through official diplomatic channels, sealed with the emblem of the Terran Commonwealth, and it was written in perfect Nethari script. Captain Ashcroft had invited him personally to tour the Erebus. Iran accepted immediately. He had been waiting for this. He had continued his research into humanity throughout the 3 weeks since their arrival, and the more he learned, the more he wanted to see them up close. Not their ship, not their technology, them. He took a shuttle from the station to the Erebus, accompanied by a single Nethari aide. The shuttle docked in one of the ship's civilian bays, a cavernous space that could have held a small city block. Iran stepped out and stood still for a long moment, looking around. The bay was busy. Human crew members moved through the space in groups and alone, carrying equipment, pushing carts, talking and laughing. A maintenance team was servicing a row of ground vehicles. A group of children, actual children, ran past, chasing each other and shrieking with laughter. One of them bumped into Iran's leg, looked up at him with wide eyes, said "Sorry, mister" in a small voice, and ran off. Iran stared after the child. Children. There were children on a warship. Captain Ashcroft met him at the bay entrance. She was out of the formal uniform she had worn in the chamber, dressed instead in the standard shipboard clothes that the crew wore: dark trousers, a fitted jacket, and boots that had seen significant wear. She looked younger than he had expected, or perhaps older. It was hard to tell with humans. Their faces carried age differently than the Nethari. "Liaison Solvek," she said, and offered her hand. He had read about the human greeting custom and took her hand in his, feeling the strange warmth of human skin against his own cool fingers. Her grip was firm. "Captain Ashcroft, thank you for the invitation." "Thank you for accepting. Most of the conquered delegates declined. I think they are still afraid of the ship." "I am also afraid of the ship," Erin said honestly. "But I am more curious than I am afraid, and in my experience, curiosity is more useful." She smiled at that. It was a genuine smile, the kind that reached the eyes, and it transformed her face completely. The woman who had walked across the deliberation chamber with the composure of a statue was gone. In her place was a person, just a person, tired and warm and alive. She gave him the tour herself. They walked the corridors of the Erebus for hours, and Erin saw things that no other alien had ever seen. He saw the engineering section, where massive conduits carried energy from the ship's stellar core to its systems, the heat visible as a shimmer in the air. He saw the weapons bays, where devices that could crack planets sat in their housings, quiet and cold, maintained by technicians who treated them with the same casual familiarity that a carpenter might show toward a hammer. He saw the laboratories, where scientists studied everything from quantum physics to alien biology, their workbenches covered in equipment and half-finished experiments and empty coffee cups. He saw the residential districts, where people lived their lives in apartments that could have been on any planet. He saw a woman tending a small garden on her balcony, growing tomatoes under artificial sunlight. He saw an old man sitting in a park, reading a book made of actual paper, a technology so ancient that it should have been in a museum. He saw two teenagers arguing about music in a corridor, their voices loud and passionate and full of the conviction that only the young possess. He saw the cafeteria, where hundreds of crew members ate meals that came from dozens of different cultural traditions. He smelled spices he could not identify and heard laughter he could not understand. A group of engineers waved at Ashcroft as she passed, and she waved back, and one of them shouted something that made her roll her eyes and shake her head and smile. These were not conquerors. These were not warriors. These were people. Ordinary, messy, complicated, beautiful people who happened to live inside the most powerful weapon the galaxy had ever seen. Erin understood now why Ashcroft had walked into the chamber alone. It was not because she was brave, although she was. It was not because she wanted to intimidate, although she had. It was because she was representative. She was one person, one human, carrying the weight of her entire species on her shoulders, and she had walked that long aisle because that was what humans did. They carried impossible weights to impossible places, and they did it because someone had to, and they had decided it would be them. At the end of the tour, Ashcroft brought Erin to an observation lounge near the bow of the ship. The room had a viewport that stretched from floor to ceiling, 30 meters wide, offering a view of the space ahead. The Nexus station was visible in the distance, a small cluster of lights. The conquered fleet was a scatter of tiny shapes around it. From here, from inside the Erebus, they looked very small and very far away. They stood together at the viewport in comfortable silence. Erin looked out at the galaxy and thought about everything he had seen. "Captain," he said, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course." "Were you afraid, walking into that chamber alone?" She did not answer immediately. She looked out the viewport, and the stars reflected in her eyes, and for a moment she looked like someone standing at the edge of a very high cliff, remembering what it felt like to look down. "Every second," she said. "Then why did you do it?" She turned to face him, and the smile came back, but this time it was different. It was not the polite smile of a diplomat or the warm smile of a host. It was the smile of someone who had faced the worst thing they could imagine and come out the other side, battered and shaking but still standing. "Because that is what humans do," she said. "We walk into rooms we have no business being in and we make them ours." Irin Solvek looked at her for a long time. He thought about the data he had read, the history of a species that had clawed its way from the mud of a death world to the stars, fighting every step, losing millions along the way, and never once stopping. He thought about the chamber and the single shadow crossing the floor. He thought about the 12 dead ships drifting in space and the message that brought them back to life. And he understood, finally, the most terrifying thing about humanity. They were never as afraid as they should be, and they had built everything they had, every ship, every city, every triumph, and every wonder, not in spite of their fear, but because of it. Fear was not their weakness. Fear was their fuel. They burned it like the star at the heart of their impossible ship, and it drove them forward, always forward into the dark. He nodded slowly and turned back to the viewport. The galaxy stretched out before them, vast and ancient and full of species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. And somewhere out there, on a small blue planet orbiting a modest yellow star, a species that had no right to be here had decided to come anyway. "Captain," Irin said quietly. "Yes. I think you were worth knowing." Ashcroft laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and bright and warm, and it echoed off the viewport and filled the observation lounge with a sound that was purely, unmistakably human. "So were you, Liaison," she said. "So were you." They stood together at the window for a while longer, the alien and the human, looking out at the stars. Behind them, the Erebus hummed with the quiet energy of 80,000 lives being lived. Ahead of them, the galaxy waited, full of questions that had not yet been asked and answers that had not yet been given. In the centuries that followed, historians of 100 species would argue about the moment the galaxy truly changed. Some pointed to the arrival of the Erebus. Some pointed to the vote. Some pointed to the 12 dead ships and the message that brought them back. But those who had been in the chamber that day knew the truth. It changed when one shadow crossed the floor, unhurried, unarmored, unafraid. And the galaxy learned that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not a warship 37 kilometers long. It was the species that built it and then sent a single woman to speak for it. One shadow crossed the chamber, and the stars were never quiet again.